Imagine this. You blink awake in a cold, stone room. The air stinks of piss, bleach, and despair. They're screaming down the hall. Raw, animalistic, endless. You try to move, but your wrists are bound. You're not in a hospital. You're not in a prison. You're in a Victorian asylum. A place where the line between treatment and torture didn't just blur. It disappeared. And here's the worst part. You didn't even have to be mad to end up here. Women were committed for hysteria. Translation, having emotions. Men were committed for melancholia. Translation, being sad. Children were committed for epilepsy. And if you were poor, foreign, queer, political, outspoken, or just inconvenient to someone with a last name worth money, congratulations, you were legally insane. The Victorian asylum system wasn't about healing. It was about hiding, about burying the socially inconvenient under a thick coat of moral righteousness and pseudoscience. Treatment was just a polite word for breaking the will. If you were admitted, the first thing they took was your name. Not legally, psychologically. You became a patient number, a case file, a problem to be managed. Your clothes were replaced with rags. Your voice ignored. Your dignity erased. The doctors? They didn't want to hear your story. They wanted to observe your symptoms, preferably while poking your skull or electrocuting your brain. You weren't a person anymore. You were data. Once inside, you didn't get out. Not because of how sick you were, but because the institution needed bodies. More patients meant more funding, so recoveries weren't celebrated. They were discouraged. Your protests were labeled agitation. Your silence was catatonia. Your desire to leave? Proof you were still insane. And so, day after day, you'd sit, or scream, or weep into your threadbare mattress. And the staff would nod and write in their notebooks, "Patient continues to exhibit instability." Victorian asylums didn't cure people, they produced them. Welcome to your first treatment. That's what they call it. Treatment. Not punishment. Not torment. Not barbarism wrapped in Victorian velvet. No, treatment. Because suffering, you see, is therapeutic when a man with a mustache and a medical degree says so. Let's start with hydrotherapy. Sounds relaxing, right? A nice warm bath to soothe your nerves? Wrong. Try being stripped naked and locked into an ice-cold tub for hours. Sometimes days. Your limbs restrained, your skin puckering, your lips turning blue while the attendants assure you it's for your own good. Shivering wasn't a sign of discomfort. It was a symptom. And the cure? More water. Still feeling emotional? Perhaps some rotational therapy will help. This Victorian innovation involved strapping patients to a chair and spinning them until they vomited or passed out, whichever came first. The idea was simple. Confuse the demons right out of you. Nausea as salvation. Or maybe you were just too restless. Enter the Utica crib. A lovely wooden cage that looks like a child's bed, except you're an adult and you're not allowed to leave. You lie there, motionless, for hours while staff stroll by, sipping tea and congratulating each other on their progressive mental health practices. Electricity was also very in vogue. Electroconvulsive therapy, minus the anesthesia, of course. Why dull the experience? Electrodes applied directly to your temples, current flooding your brain, your body convulsing while your caretakers calmly recorded your reactions. If you screamed, that was progress. If you didn't, well, they just turn up the voltage. But if all else failed, if your mind still dared to resist, there was always trepanation. That's right. Drill a hole straight into the skull. Let the madness escape. Literal holes in your head, performed with the delicacy of a butcher. All in the name of balance and humors and whatever pseudoscientific trash they were peddling that decade. And guess what? None of these were considered cruel. These weren't hidden atrocities. They were proudly published in medical journals, demonstrated at conferences, applauded by peers. They were the standard of care. This wasn't a horror story hidden in shadows. It was policy. Wake up. If you slept at all, the mattress is thin enough to feel every lump of the iron frame beneath it. And the blanket? Stained, frayed, and too short to cover both your feet and your shame. A bell rings, not to gently ease you into the day, but to command it. You're not a person, remember? You're a schedule. First stop, the washroom, where dozens of patients are herded like livestock. There's no privacy, just a trough of tepid water, one cracked mirror, and a nurse who treats you like an unruly dog. If you resist the routine, maybe you cry, maybe you flinch, that's noted. You're uncooperative. Another mark on your growing file. Breakfast is porridge. Always porridge. Sometimes warm, often cold, never enough. Conversation is discouraged. Laughter is suspicious. Silence is mandatory. The staff don't dine with you, they supervise. Clipboards in hand, watching how you chew. Patient appears distracted. Patient doesn't finish meal. Patient stares into void. Then comes occupational therapy, which is Victorian for unpaid labor. Sewing, weaving, sweeping endless corridors. They called it restorative work. But it wasn't about healing. It was about obedience. Producing something, anything, proved you were salvageable. Sit too still and you're apathetic. Work too fast and you're manic. There is no correct speed. Afternoons are reserved for recreation, which means standing in a courtyard surrounded by high walls and barbed wire, breathing in damp air and trying not to make eye contact. Some patients pace in circles. Others mutter to themselves. Some just stare at the sky like they're praying for God to misplace a lightning bolt. Evenings bring inspections, not medical ones, disciplinary. The staff check for contraband, notes, sharp objects, dignity. They ask if you're feeling better, but it's rhetorical. Your answer doesn't matter. If you say yes, you're lying. If you say no, you're deteriorating. Either way, you stay. Then it's back to bed. Back to the screams, the darkness, the reeking air. You lie there and try to remember who you were before this place, what your voice sounded like, whether the outside world is still real or just another delusion they forgot to beat out of you, because in the Victorian Asylum, madness wasn't something you had. It was something they crafted. Let's talk science, or rather, the Victorian version of it. A cocktail of prejudice, guesswork, and just enough Latin to sound legitimate. Because in the world of asylums, diagnosis wasn't discovery. It was labeling. And those labels were less about brains and more about behavior, especially if your behavior made others uncomfortable. Were you a woman who didn't want children? Nymphomania. A man uninterested in marriage? Moral insanity? An Irish immigrant with an accent? Degenerative dementia? Too loud? Mania? Too quiet? Melancholia? Too brown? Too gay? Too poor? Too different? Lunatic. This wasn't medicine. It was social sorting with a white coat on. Doctors would examine your skull for abnormal bumps, a practice known as phrenology, which has as much scientific merit as reading tea leaves. According to them, criminality, laziness, and rebelliousness were measurable on your scalp. Didn't matter if you were sane. If your forehead said otherwise, welcome to lifelong confinement. And let's not forget eugenics, the fashionable theory of the elite. The belief that mental illness, conveniently redefined as anything from epilepsy to poverty, was hereditary filth that needed to be sterilized out of the population. Literally, Forced sterilizations weren't a secret. They were medical recommendations. Patients weren't treated. They were neutralized, controlled, rendered harmless to the fragile sensibilities of normal society. And the data? Cooked to fit the theory. Any evidence that someone recovered without intervention? Ignored. Any sign that the system caused more harm than help? Suppressed. This wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system. A machine designed not to cure, but to cleanse morally, racially, socially. The Victorian Asylum didn't evolve from medicine. It evolved from fear. Let's meet the staff, the fine, upstanding citizens entrusted with your care. Your first encounter is likely with a nurse. But don't expect Florence Nightingale. Victorian Asylum nurses weren't angels in white. They were wardens in aprons, underpaid, overworked, and often recruited not for their compassion, but for their discipline. The job description? Keep the patients quiet, clean, and contained. In that order. Abuse wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. Slaps, restraints, forced feedings, all part of a day's work. And if you resisted, that was called non-compliance, and non-compliance demanded escalation. Enter the attendants, men hired for their strength, not their subtlety. Their qualifications? A strong arm and a tolerance for screams. Their favorite tools? Leather straps, isolation cells, and their own fists. They weren't there to listen. They were there to maintain order. And order meant obedience through fear. Then there were the doctors, the high priests of Victorian psychiatry. Educated, eloquent, and entirely convinced they were saving the world one broken mind at a time. Their instruments were syringes, scalpels, and smugness. They believed madness was a moral failure, a stain to be scrubbed off with pain and procedure. But here's the secret no one wrote down in the ledgers. These institutions ran on incentives. The more patients they held, the more funding they received. Each bed filled meant another pound sterling in the budget. Recovery? Inconvenient. Releases? Discouraged. Empty beds meant lost income. So patients who showed improvement were often re-diagnosed or punished until their symptoms returned. There were even rumors, and occasionally evidence, of patients provoked on purpose, pushed into breakdowns just to justify their continued stay. And the inspections? Scheduled in advance, hallways scrubbed, patients sedated, smiles rehearsed. The asylum didn't have to be humane, it just had to look presentable for long enough to keep the funding flowing. These people weren't healers. They were custodians of suffering, working in a factory of despair, where each scream was just another item on the checklist. When you entered a Victorian asylum, the outside world didn't just forget you, it rewrote you. Your family might visit. Once. Maybe twice. Then the letters stopped. The whispers began. She's not well. He's in a place where they can help him. The shame was too heavy, and society too eager to look away. So they did. And you disappeared, not in a dramatic burst, but in a slow erosion of memory. Name fading from conversation, face fading from photographs. A living erasure. The longer you stayed, the more the institution became your entire universe. The walls weren't just barriers, they were the boundaries of your identity. Your file grew thicker, your number more permanent. Birthdays passed, unacknowledged. Holidays came and went without color, without warmth. No one asked how you were. No one expected you to get better. The system had already decided who you were, and it wasn't someone with a future. Some died quickly. Pneumonia, starvation, suicide. Others decayed over decades, their minds hollowed out not by illness, but by routine. Years of overmedication, isolation, and silence could do what no diagnosis ever could. They turned people into shadows. You became the echo of a person who once existed, a name on a chart, a body in a ward. Eventually, a shallow grave behind the facility, marked by a number or nothing at all. And yet, when these places finally closed their doors, decades later, under pressure, scandal, or modernization, the narrative changed. Suddenly, they were called early mental health pioneers. Their brutal techniques were primitive but well-intentioned. The files were sealed, the graves overgrown, the horror papered over with a museum plaque or a gentrified renovation. Tourists now sip lattes where patients once screamed. They take selfies in front of rusted restraints and faded murals, unaware that the floorboards beneath them soaked up centuries of suffering. The institutions didn't just bury people, they buried truth. And the modern world, hungry for closure and uncomfortable with complexity, let them. The real legacy of the Victorian Asylum isn't in textbooks or psychiatric manuals. It's in the silence that followed, in the lives stolen, rewritten, and erased by a system that confused obedience with wellness and pain with progress. So no, you wouldn't survive one day in a Victorian asylum, not because you're weak, but because you're human. And in that place, humanity was the first thing they took.